Good evening, New York 14. My name is Gerardo Bonilla Chavez, and I am the Chief of Staff for the Office of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Thank you for joining our monthly town hall. Just a few housekeeping items. If you're logged into the Zoom meeting, please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Please mention what neighborhood or city you're from. Alternatively, you can email your questions to aoc.townhall@mail.house.gov or call 718-662-5970. Our staff is also available to support with any technical difficulties. Our team members will be monitoring the inbox and phone. We are also live on the Congresswoman's YouTube channel, so feel free to visit her YouTube page for the live stream. Cart open captions is provided by All Hands in Motion. If you click on the link in the chat, it will take you to a website where you can view the transcription. Si necesita traducción en español, haga clic en el botón de Languages en la parte inferior de la pantalla y seleccione Spanish para acceder el audio en español. También puede someter su pregunta escrita por español medio del chat. Si está llamando por teléfono y gustaría hacer una pregunta, por favor envíe un mensaje de correo electrónico a aoc.townhall@mail.house.gov o llame al 718-662-5970. For today's town hall, we will hear from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez about the Green New Deal and FEMA funeral funds. We will then open up for a Q&A from constituents. After the Q&A, there will be a press gaggle where members of the press will be able to pose their question. Now it's my distinct honor to introduce Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Everyone, how are you? I'm just making sure I've got my video on. Welcome again to our April town hall. We're so very excited to be hosting it, and again to be making sure that we are upholding our practice of doing at least one town hall a month. And so far in our new term, not only did we hit that in our last term, but we're hitting at 100% for our new term as well. Thank you so much, Gerardo, for hosting our town hall this month. For those who don't know, Gerardo is our chief of staff here for the New York 14 Congressional Office, and he's our guest MC for this month. So thank you, Gerardo, for opening up our town hall. And I think we should dive right into things. I wanted to make sure that we did a quick update and open and making sure that we really wish all of our neighbors and all of our community that's celebrating a Ramadan Mubarak. It's such an incredible time for us to come together to break fast soon. So I'll try to make sure that we finish this before fasting and before sunset rather. We're just thrilled to be able to make sure that we connect and support one another as a community. Speaking of which, I think it's really important that we acknowledge how significant and difficult and complex a week this was, not only with the verdict announcement in the Derek Chauvin case on the murder of George Floyd, but also with the recent killings of Daunte Wright, Adam Toledo, Ma'Khia Bryant, Andrew Brown, and so many others who have been victim, but may not have been named. And so I want to make sure that we have space for that we acknowledge that, but also that we offer any support possible to our community in that time. So as we move ahead, again, I wanted to provide an update. Happy Earth Week, and what an Earth Week it has been. There has been a lot of movement on the climate Jobs and Justice Front. This Earth Week, we reintroduced the Green New Deal, and I am incredibly excited about the progress that we've been making on this front. This year, when we reintroduced the Green New Deal, we have reintroduced it with a record number of co-sponsors. So we are now at 103 House co-sponsors, with even more in the Senate. That is the highest number of co-sponsors the Green New Deal has ever had. And we reintroduced it with that record high level. And I'm extraordinarily excited that we have been collaborating with so many members of Congress to make sure that we enact this legislation. And so for those of you who do not know or may not have read the resolution yet, we're extremely excited because the Green New Deal is a commitment to create 20 million good-paying union jobs in the United States on infrastructure and other projects to decarbonize our economy, in line with the IPCC report's recommendation to keep us below 1.5 degrees Celsius in warming. What makes the Green New Deal different from other climate legislation is that it establishes certain set standards. Historically, there has been this tension between environmental, this idea that we have to choose between environmental concerns or jobs or the economy. And that you may hear on Fox News or from Republicans who are trying to scaremonger around climate that stewarding our Earth and transitioning to renewable energies will destroy our economy and kill jobs. And what the Green New Deal does is that it explicitly rejects this idea. And it is legislation that not only protects jobs, but creates jobs in the process with massive public investment to decarbonize our economy in a 10-year timeframe. And so we're extremely excited to do this because it is both a jobs and justice bill, because not only is the aim to create jobs, but it's also to center frontline and disproportionately impacted communities in the process. And those communities include our congressional district right here at home, whether it is our neighbors in East Elmhurst who are disproportionately impacted with fumes and with air pollution that has led to health issues in the past, or whether it's our neighbors in Throgs Neck that have been experiencing rising sea levels and who need extra attention as the climate crisis and investment as the climate crisis really worsens. And so what the Green New Deal does is say, listen, we are not going to leave anybody behind. And we're going to make sure that we create 20 million jobs in the process of investing in and protecting communities across the United States, but especially those who have been most deeply impacted by climate change. It is a jobs, justice, and climate bill. And again, as we mentioned, we now have over 103 co-sponsors in the House, 13 new co-sponsors that were not there last session. And so I just want to thank each and every one of you back home watching for your support and advocacy on this issue, because it is working. And not only is this just about the legislation that is the resolution itself, but since the introduction of the Green New Deal, it has been extremely influential throughout U.S. politics. As you may have seen with this Biden infrastructure bill, we have deeply influenced, and I'm not saying I have, but I think all of us have, as a people and as a movement, we have deeply influenced the way that the country, and specifically the Democratic Party and its present leadership, has approached the issue of climate change. And so with the jobs and justice frame first, we have noticed that frame has been adopted across the Democratic Party. So 2 years ago, this thing was seen as too radical and too crazy and too big and too ambitious. And then fast forward 2 years, Joe Biden just announced this week that he is now going to aim for a 40 to 60% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030. That was unthinkable 2 years ago. And I think that environmental activists and our labor and everyone who has spoken up in support of this issue in the last 2 years can claim credit for that. So thank you. But one of the biggest questions that we get is, what is next on the Green New Deal? So the Green New Deal is not just the resolution itself, because the resolution is a statement of standards and principles. It's kind of like a North Star. It's establishing the blueprint for our climate approach. But we actually have to kind of color in all of those lines with the binding bills and legislation. And so I'm also very proud to announce that since the introduction of the Green New Deal, over a dozen pieces of legislation have been rolled out and planning for transitions to create jobs and center communities across industries and across the country. Everything from regenerative agriculture and working with our farmers and ranchers and figuring out how we can use farming practices to preserve our food supply and also our topsoil, all the way to public housing. And so while over a dozen of those G&T companion bills have been introduced across members and across co-sponsors, those 103 co-sponsors of the Green New Deal, this week, I also rolled out, in partnership with other members of Congress, 3 additional pieces of legislation to help tackle key infrastructure issues to make sure that we have a just climate transition for our future. So the first the first piece of legislation that I introduced with Senator Bernie Sanders has been the Green New Deal for public housing, which just dropped this week. We are really excited about this legislation, and I've been speaking with our brothers and sisters in labor unions and the building trades, and there's a lot of excitement around this bill as well, because we are solving a lot of problems at once. As you all know, what we have seen in the conditions in NYCHA are absolutely unacceptable. So not only have we partnered with Congresswoman Nidia Velázquez to make sure that NYCHA and sorry, if you're hearing an alarm, not only have we been partnering with Congresswoman Nidia Velázquez to get NYCHA the full capital investment that it's owed, but we're also working with the Green New Deal for public housing with Senator Bernie Sanders to not only to patch up the holes in the walls and turn on the boilers, but to actually make public housing world-class. And if you see public housing in other parts of the world, you would be shocked at how beautiful and dignified and eco-friendly it is. And so the Green New Deal for public housing seeks to increase affordable housing and public housing, rather, improves living conditions for 2 million people across the United States, reduce energy bills by 70%. So we would retrofit NYCHA buildings, potentially build brand new units, because we would be repealing the Faircloth Amendment. A lot of people don't know that for over 20 years, the construction and building new public housing in the United States to add to our stock has been illegal. Building new public housing in the United States to add to our public housing stock has been illegal for over 20 years. So the Green New Deal for public housing repeals the Faircloth Amendment, which banned the construction of new public housing units. And it also says we're going to retrofit public housing across the United States. We have done this stands to create over 250,000 jobs nationwide, but we've actually done the numbers for NYCHA and say, what would we do? What would it look like if we retrofitted and really reinvested completely in Queensbridge houses or in Throgs Neck or Pelham Bay, et cetera. And what we found was that applying this bill just to NYCHA alone would create over 20,000 jobs. And that's union jobs, it's dignified and prevailing wage jobs. And what's also really great is that the provision in the Green New Deal for public housing expands Section 3 so that those jobs go to residents of our public housing system and our direct community, so that we're not employing just people in other places, which it does create those jobs too, but there's a special focus in making sure that those jobs are actually going to New Yorkers and NYCHA residents as well. The second piece of legislation that we rolled out this week with Congresswoman Cori Bush of Missouri is the Green New Deal for cities. And so what the Green New Deal for cities would do would be to take a lot of our main priorities on transition and authorizes $1 trillion to fund the implementation of Green New Deal projects in every urban community across the country. And lastly, something that I'm really excited about as well is that I have introduced with Senator Markey, who's also my co-author on the Green New Deal, legislation this week to open a civilian climate corps. Now, what this does is that it brings back a New Deal style program, which is a mass employment program for young people and all sorts of people across the country. Targeted to 1.5 million young Americans paying $15 an hour and a $25,000 in funds for college or student loans to remediate blight and increase and maintain green space. What's great about the Civilian Climate Corps is that we aren't displacing any existing jobs, but honestly, there's a lot of climate work that needs to be done that is not covered by the private sector because it's not profitable. For example, a couple of years ago, I visited some of our national parks, and what we've seen with wildfires or other forms of environmental destruction is, you see a lot of barren land. That land needs to be reforested. And it's going to require hiring a lot of people and training those people in ecological practices to restore our lands, to rebuild them, and to also construct and expand increased green spaces across the country as well. And so the Civilian Climate Corps would create over 1 million jobs targeted particularly among young people, and also providing educational grants and assistance for any educational college or otherwise opportunities that they'd like to pursue. And it's a really exciting program. And this was very successful during the New Deal and the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. And this is an idea that we're kind of bringing back. We're putting a climate twist on it, and we're also adding a focus on equity and racial and social justice. So we're really excited about these 3 new pieces of legislation that are dropped now this week, in addition to the many other Green New Deal legislative bills that have also dropped. So that's kind of a quick update on that. And we'll move on to our next slide. Some other areas of Green New Deal progress since we introduced the resolution the first time 2 years ago. 10 localities, cities, and states have adopted local versions of the Green New Deal. This includes the state of Maine and major cities like Seattle, right here in New York City. And there are also proposals that have been introduced in cities like Austin, Los Angeles, et cetera. And so, where sometimes that progress federally may lack, we have also been working with and inspired a lot of this progress and using these principles to create progress, at least to move forward on the city and state level. And that has been enormously impactful so far. That part about the ban on public housing, we have taken components of Green New Deal legislation, we've pulled out some of the provisions, and we've actually put them into other larger House bills that have needed to be passed. And so a lot of time people think that our legislative process is just, I would introduce a bill, that bill gets passed, and it gets signed into law, and it's the only way that you can pass legislation. But there are also larger pieces of legislation, and what we can do is that we can take our bills and you take the name off and you try to put it inside a larger bill. And when that bill gets passed, it also enacts your legislation. And so we've been able to do that successfully with some components of the Green New Deal so far. And so one is that last year, when the House had a much larger infrastructure bill, that was passed last year, and we were able to take a repeal of the ban on construction of new public housing. And we were able to put it into that House infrastructure bill last year, and it passed the House. And why that's really significant is because we have now established precedent that Democrats are willing to do this, which means that now we have a much greater chance of passing repeal of the Fair Cloth Amendment in either the Biden infrastructure bill or another bill that may be passing this term. So that's a huge, huge area of progress, because we will be ending a generation-long ban on public housing in the United States and construction of new public housing in the United States, which I think will attract a lot more investment and will also have, I think, also some side effects of attracting new public, desperately needed investment in existing public housing like we have with NYCHA. And kind of on that note, we've been fighting for that as this infrastructure plan comes together. So there's that. Another huge piece of support is that the Coal Workers Union, who I sat down with 2 years ago, has now announced support for clean energy jobs and a just transition. This is enormously exciting. I deeply commend the Coal Miners Union, and we're going to work together to make sure that those jobs are absolutely being focused in places like coal country, so that those families aren't left transitioning with no opportunity, but that they will be, communities that have provided and worked on producing energy for our country and will continue to do that for our country. This Monday, as I mentioned, Biden announced that he plans to cut emissions by half in 2030. I don't think that it is an exaggeration to say that 2 years ago, it was almost unthinkable to think that Joe Biden would be making an announcement like that, especially because we had similar goals in the Green New Deal and were mocked by it, even within the Democratic Party. And now he's making these announcements, which I think, again, is really important, but it's also important for us to hold the president accountable, because it's one thing to say that that's what we want to do. It's another thing to actually back it up with the investments and the policy that's going to do it. And so one thing that has been a concern of mine in the infrastructure plan that President Biden has advanced is that the vision that they say, the vision that and their stated goals for the infrastructure plan are great. We need to make sure that we replace every lead pipe in the United States. We need to make sure that we clean the water of disproportionately impacted communities, including communities like ours. However, my concern is that with the actual plan, their starting offer that they presented, it doesn't have the numbers necessary to actually do what they say they want to do. And so that's why we have been on the side of trying to pressure the administration to be a little bit more ambitious. One great example is that they said nationally, they want to invest $40 billion over 10 years in public housing. For context, $40 billion is what the New York City Housing Authority needs alone. And not in 10 years, they need it as soon as possible. And so if we really want to meet the ambition of this wonderful vision that I think we've helped, and the movement and people's movements have helped influence, we have to make sure that that gets backed up with the actual dollars and cents and policy and investment to make sure that that vision becomes a reality. Additionally, on polling, you may hear people giving the Green New Deal a hard time. Well, we did polling, and it's not as bad as Fox News tries to make it out to be. We did polling, and the Green New Deal is popular. 60% of voters across the country now support a Green New Deal, including more than a third of Republicans. And so we're chipping away, and we're not going to stop. And I'm really excited to continue to give you all updates on our progress on that front. Now, secondly, I wanted to provide a key update on funeral assistance programs that we had worked on a lot last year. We ended last year with a major victory where I was working very closely with some of our community leaders like Saida Dunstan at Elm Corps in East Elmhurst and Elmhurst overall, and to make sure that for communities like ours, you all know we were the epicenter of the epicenter last year on COVID. And not only was our congressional district the #1 most impacted district by COVID at the start of the pandemic, but it was at that time, because it was at the start of the pandemic, that we were so deeply impacted before we knew anything, before we knew much about COVID at all. We didn't know for sure what the vectors of transmission were. We didn't know exactly how contagious COVID was. We didn't know as much about asymptomatic versus symptomatic transmission the way that we do now. And so not only were we heavily impacted, but we were impacted first when we had the least amount of tools. And so because of that, our community suffered a lot. And especially for our community that are frontline and essential workers who were more at risk, or when you look at the income or racial disparities, it didn't hit at all communities equally, and it hit ours particularly tough. And so we started working with community activists and advocates starting last year, where they said we need to get funeral assistance. And so we worked for the bulk of the year to make sure on this project, to see if the federal government, to see if we could create a program where the federal government will reimburse any and all funeral expenses for anyone that was lost during COVID, and for their families. And so we had our first major victory at the end of last year. I am shocked that we got Donald Trump to sign this. We did it because we slipped it into a larger bill. So I don't know if he knew he was signing this. I don't know if he knew he was signing my legislation, but we'll take whatever we can get. And so it was first authorized, but then during the Biden administration, we were able to expand and extend that program. So if you have lost a loved one from as far back as January 2020, and it applies to the future, actually, if anyone is impacted into next year, into 2022, FEMA will reimburse your family up to $9,000 in funeral and burial expenses. We launched the program about a week or two ago. The lines first opened. There is no income cap. We are not going to means test this because COVID has been so difficult. And, I think it's, especially when it comes to a pandemic, but in general, a lot of these means testing saying, oh, you can only make 75K. We saw this with stimulus checks. People's financial situations change so much that you may be on paper making something 2 years ago, but you may be in need now. And so there's no income cap on this program. It is also okay for mixed status and undocumented people to be covered. And so the way that works is that if your loved one who passed away was undocumented, a documented person can file for reimbursements for if they paid or if there were expenses related to laying an undocumented loved one to rest. So that creates a lot of really broad opportunity for people in our community that have been so deeply impacted. A couple of rules around it: only one application can happen per funeral. So you can't have 5 people who apply for one person's passing. So our recommendation is to make sure that if those expenses were shared among multiple people, to select one person to be the applicant and just pool all of those expenses. So there's one applicant per funeral. The deceased person's documentation status, again, is not considered. And the death certificate must list COVID-19 anywhere. It could be as the primary cause of death. It could be as a contributing cause of death. For our community, it hit us very early on when we didn't know what was COVID and what wasn't, frankly. And so there's flexibility there. If your loved one's death certificate does not list COVID-19 as a primary or contributing cause of death, which is quite a few people in our community because it was happening so early on, you can go to the institution that filed the death, that issued the death certificate, whether it was a hospital or a healthcare provider, or you can go to the medical examiner and ask them to reassess cause of death. And if in a medical professional's view, looking back, having the data that we have now, medically and in public health, they can update your loved one's death certificate to include COVID-19 or offer a kind of an additional letter. And that can help you qualify for FEMA assistance. I actually was speaking with Senator Schumer, who I partnered with on making this happen. And I don't even know if I mentioned this to our staff earlier today, so this is news to everybody. But we saw the program officially opened a week ago. When it first opened, it was enormously popular. Over 1 million calls were made into FEMA within the first 24 hours. This also includes people who were calling multiple times because the opening day was just a lot of people trying to get through. But in some of the latest numbers that we just found out in what I just got an update from on FEMA is that in the first week that this program has been open, there have been over 130,000 applications for reimbursement. Again, this hasn't been screened for any double applications or anything like that, but that raw number represents about 20% of the entire death toll of COVID-19 so far. So what that tells us is that this is an enormously popular program. We're helping a lot of people, and the first checks have also been issued for reimbursement as well. So it looks like this process is going quite swiftly, and those checks went to actually some folks in Texas, and that 13,000 people in the state of New York have also applied for FEMA reimbursement as well. So thankfully, if you are blessed enough to not need this, perhaps you know someone that could benefit. So please make sure that you jot down this phone number. Just call 844-684-6333. That is the FEMA hotline, and you'll be able to get help as soon as we can process it. And yeah, I think we'll head over to the Q&A.
Yeah, great introductory remarks. There's a lot happening in DC. So now we're going to move to the Q&A of our portion of our town hall. And as mentioned earlier, constituents can sign on via the Zoom platform may use the Q&A feature to submit their questions. Please remember to mention your neighborhood, and you also may be able to write your question in Spanish. Also, just a reminder to members of the press, there will be a Q&A, or after the Q&A section, there will be a press gaggle when you'll be able to ask your questions. So the first question I got, Congresswoman, we got two questions, very similar, one from Dave in Sunnyside and Mari from Jackson Heights. Each submitted a question regarding whether nuclear power is part of the Green New Deal.
I think this is a great question. So what I think is really important about the Green New Deal is that it's technology agnostic. So the Green New Deal does not take a formal position for or against any specific technology. What it does is that it is strict about the 10-year timeline on reducing carbon emissions. And so when it comes to this question of nuclear, it's agnostic on it. It doesn't take a position pro, it doesn't take a position that's anti. But what is really important is basically saying we want to support decarbonization efforts that have a just process that help us hit our target within 10 years.
Roland from Allerton asks, is universal basic income part of the Green New Deal?
I think this is a great question. So presently, UBI is not specifically cited as a Green New Deal program. That doesn't mean that we are opposed to it, though. It's simply not included in like one of the lists. But again, we're not opposed to UBI programs, and in fact, one of the things that we've been really trying to champion is UBI right now. We have really been working towards recurring stimulus checks, and we've been trying to really press the Biden administration on that, because we know that, I don't want us to think that our work on COVID is done just because we passed the American Rescue Plan in January. We are going to need a lot of support, and a lot of people are going to need a lot of continuing support in the future. And so while that is not while it's not necessarily in G&D legislation, I don't want you to think that it's not in any legislation. And in fact, I think one thing that we're trying to do is almost like a mini backdoor UBI is a lot of you will be receiving child checks starting in July. And so if you are a single person that's making between $75,000 and $95,000, you will be, or if you are a couple that's making combined up to $150,000 to $170,000, you'll be receiving about $300, a check for $300 for every child. So it's almost like a baby UBI that is being piloted this year. So it's almost like a UBI for every child that you have, which it makes it baby in two respects. One, because it's not yet a fully fledged UBI program, which I know we're working with a lot of constituents in advocacy on what that would look like. But at least we're able to get something out the door right now, starting in July, for babies and children, not just babies, but any child under 17. So it's starting with a pilot, and those will be 7 checks, $300 for about $300 a month. But we are also pushing to make that permanent as well.
Awesome. Excuse me. So we got one in Spanish. Mi nombre es Mirana Reyes. Soy de Queens y yo llamé para hacer a la aplicación y me piden un socio, y ustedes saben que los inmigrantes no contenemos con dichos documentos, funeral expenses. So es una pregunta sobre funeral expenses y los documentos que necesitan.
Okay, perfecto, gracias. And I'll just translate the question very quickly at the top, then I'll answer it in Spanish, then I'll do an English translation as well. So the English translation to, and Gerardo, her name is Liana. Okay, I think it's Liana. Oh.
Miriana.
Liliana. So to our constituent Liliana, voy a traducir en inglés y después te voy a dar una respuesta en español. So Liliana, our constituent Liliana is asking, I called up FEMA and they asked me for a social security number. For those, you may know that for our immigrant community, not everyone has a social security number, but that's what they asked for when they called in for FEMA. What do I do? Okay, bueno, Liliana, yo no sé si eres indocumentado o simplemente si no tienes ciudadanía todavía, pero hay 2 soluciones. Uno, si eres un residente permanente, creo que usted te puedes dar su número ese número de la residencia, pero si eres indocumentado, personas que son indocumentados no pueden aplicar, pero si trabajas con un miembro de su familia, un amigo o amiga, un vecino o otra persona que conoces bien, que conoces bien, ello o ella puede aplicar, por usted. y es necesario a dar ellos a su, bueno, el certificado de fallecido. Creo que eso es la terma, el certificado de fallecido y también los recetas. Y ellos pueden aplicar por usted y después a trabajar con ustedes cuando los fondos llegan. Eso es mi, eso es mi sugestión. Eso es, I don't know, suggestion, perdón. Eso es lo que creo, ese proceso que es más, bueno, fácil por usted, pero también puedes llamar a mi oficina y podemos trabajar con usted sobre los detalles de tu aplicación y de tu situación y después podemos ver, bueno, el camino que es más fácil por usted y su familia. So in English, I basically said, there's two kind of paths here if you are undocumented or if you are a permanent resident. If you are a US permanent resident, you can probably give FEMA your number that's associated with that instead of your social security number. If you are undocumented though, undocumented people cannot apply directly for the FEMA program, but we've made the rules as flexible as possible so that if you have a family member, if you have a friend, a loved one, a neighbor, you can work with them to apply to FEMA to get the reimbursement necessary in the program. And so what you'd have to do would be to provide that person with the death certificate and receipts, invoices, et cetera, and then work on that as well. But, I think for the details of that particular situation or case, if anyone kind of has a situation like that, just call my office directly and we can figure out the path that is easiest for you given the details of your case.
One thing to mention as well is that in the chat, there's a link to the FEMA website where there's a number of languages that can help explain the process for everybody. All right, the next question comes from Solange in Astoria and Andrew in College Park. Both ask about the Astoria power plant. Solange asked, I know that you rightfully oppose the proposed renovations. However, I'd like to know what is being proposed as an alternative. Andrew, well, actually, I'll pause there and you can answer and I'll circle back.
Sure, no, so thank you so much for this question. First and foremost, for those who may not be aware, there is a lot of opposition right now because there's a proposed power plant in Astoria, but the source of the power for that power plant would be a fracking line. And we have very deep concerns about the health impacts that has on our constituents, on you all, on the quality of your water and your air. Fracking lines are notorious, and the supply chain for fracking lines are notorious for being rife with methane emissions, and they are really dangerous for our planet. They are up to 68 times more powerful than just normal CO2 emissions, but also the health effects. I toured communities in Colorado that were deeply impacted by fracking. And there are families that when they open their windows, they're telling us stories about how their throat burns. And all of this methane is completely invisible. So unlike other power plants or factories that you may see where there's this like kind of plume of smoke, with fracking and methane emissions, it's completely invisible. And so you're just kind of, for some of these families that I toured with, you're going about your day, and then all of a sudden, your nasal passages, they were telling us stories about just like, it would just hit them like a brick. And with so much that our community is dealing with, I just don't think that it's not in line with our values. But what do we do instead? Well, I think there are a lot of exciting projects on kind of coming down the pipeline, I guess, to use an inappropriate term. But in the Biden infrastructure plan, we are looking to get a lot of offshore wind projects In New Jersey, the governor of New Jersey has been really pushing ahead and requesting these offshore wind projects. And I don't want to, reveal anything too early, but we are also trying to lay some of the groundwork to bring offshore wind projects. Those are wind turbines, and bring those districts not just to New York City, but also to our communities in particular, so that our community can help get the training and the jobs that come with construction of wind turbines. And so I would say personally that some of the greatest and most exciting areas of opportunity for New York City in particular are wind, but also, of course, solar is a huge area of opportunity. Again, like other members of our community brought up earlier in this town hall, kind of alternative, other forms of alternative energy. But I think given the actual geography of our district and the unique assets that we have, I think wind would be the number one for us. It would be the best fit for us in our pocket of the world.
I think you answered Andrew's question there. So on to the next one. Pat and Marjorie from East Elmhurst, alongside Jonathan from Jackson Heights, each submitted a question about the air train. Mm-hmm. Question is, what is your stance on the proposed air train, and how does it tie into the Green New Deal, Green New Deal and climate legislation?
So I will be frank. While I am a huge advocate of rail, I could not disagree more with the current air train project. And I'll explain to you all why. One is because the ultimate goal of any successful air train project is to help people be less reliant on cars to go to the airport. And that means making a faster and easier commute to LaGuardia, whether that's from Midtown Manhattan or whether it's from Queens or any other area that an air train would run through. The current proposed scope of the air train project is way more difficult and cumbersome than taking a car, and the way that it cuts through the community also, frankly, it really, I think, runs contrary to our values of environmental justice and climate justice. And so a lot of this air train construction, the proposed path, it cuts through already deeply impacted communities, and it disadvantages them further. And also, the actual plan for it doesn't make sense. I do think that there's a possibility for us to create a project that does make sense. So I'll just say very briefly why it doesn't make sense. I wish I kind of had like a board or something, but basically I kind of maybe do. Okay, no, I won't get into it. Basically, we have LaGuardia Airport. I'm just going to do it. If we have LaGuardia Airport here, right? And y'all can't even see this. If we have LaGuardia Airport here and we have Manhattan, say right here, the proposed path for the air train is to go all the way out here and then have people kind of transfer and then go all the way in. And so in the process, that path cuts through East Elmhurst, and it cuts through all of these other areas. And then it goes in, and it takes such a long time that any kind of sensible person that's trying to get to the airport using public transit, I don't think would really utilize this. I don't think it would utilize that infrastructure, which would continue the reliance on using cars to go to LaGuardia. I think the route, if LaGuardia's airport is here, we already have, there are a lot of different alternatives that we have spoken to with both the FAA and the local community about. Our folks in Queens and in Elmhurst, we've heard suggestions about, we have the N train, the N and the Q that already go up here. And we could just build a linkage that just goes from there to here. That is much easier than doing this whole thing where you're doing a whole merry-go-round around the entire borough of Queens just to get to LaGuardia Airport. So that's one reason, it's the route. But the other reasons too is that we have been going back and forth because there are a lot of sustainable alternatives in addition to just the construction of an air train. We asked them to examine rapid bus lines, the way that we have the, I think it was the Q44 that goes to LaGuardia, or the Q40, Q60. I have to get my bus lines right. To LaGuardia, that goes straight from Harlem, crosses the bridge and goes to LaGuardia. And that's been extremely effective in getting people to LGA. But for the most part from our community, I've heard almost nothing but resistance to this project. And also it is billions and billions and billions of dollars on an infrastructure project that doesn't make logistical sense. And our greatest fear is that it's not just wasteful, but that it's harmful and that it won't maximize our opportunity of getting cars off the road, especially folks going to and from, especially when it comes to airport traffic. And so, so that is my present stance on this issue. I have been writing to the FAA, and not only that, but we're also seeing that there's been reporting recently that the process for the certification of this project looks like it was really sketchy. Like there was really a lot of things that were bypassed in due diligence in the authorization of this project, which we have been following up and are following up on with the FAA and other authorities.
Next question comes from Corey in Sunnyside. Do you have any thoughts on how to ensure that the care for and reuse of our existing building stocks is accounted for or perhaps incentivized in your framework?
So I think that this is a really important question. And so what the Green New Deal for Public Housing does is that it's not just, it actually isn't just about centering the construction of new public housing, but I would argue that the bulk of the bill focuses on existing housing stock, on retrofitting our public housing stock and also upgrading it. And so there are two aspects to that. One is that as a lot of people may not know, when you think about what are some of the largest contributors to carbon emissions in the country, the first thing that people will think are, cars and airplanes and transportation in general. But actually, one of the largest contributors to carbon emissions in the country are buildings. And what we have right now, especially with our older buildings, is that they have a lot of inefficient systems, whether it's heating, whether it's the actual physical infrastructure of the building, the way that it was built, in being inefficient in allowing heat to come in when it's cold and for it to stay cool. There's actually construction techniques like passive house techniques to construct a building in a way that kind of maximizes temperature without needing to be overly reliant more than necessary on air conditioning or straining your heating units. And the Green New Deal for Public Housing accommodates that to invest in that, in those retrofits of existing buildings in places like NYCHA. But it's not just in the actual bones of a building. What's really important is, as I mentioned, the systems that are related to a building, and that includes water, heat, and electricity. So what the Green New Deal for Public Housing would do with that would be, it would create a lot of jobs and projects to, for example, start the process of transitioning NYCHA to solar power. That's one example. Another example is how what we are starting to learn more and more about gas stoves, especially in smaller apartment style buildings, is how much of a health hazard they can be for similar reasons in what I was talking about with methane, is that it emits gas that we cannot see, but that we could breathe in. And what we're starting to learn is that these really high child asthma rates, especially in facilities like NYCHA, could potentially have a connection to the actual appliances of these buildings. And so the Green New Deal for Public Housing not only addresses the bones of the building, it addresses the heat, electricity, and other support systems in the building. And it also focuses on programs to upgrade appliances to be clean energy focused, so electric stoves, et cetera, which also has really important health benefits as well.
Great. This may be the last question. We'll see if we can sneak one more in after this one. Jennifer from Jackson Heights asks, how are working class people supposed to afford paying for every increasing electricity and now increasing gas price?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that this is the key question, is that working people shouldn't have to bear the brunt of that bill. And the problems that we have right now is that the way that we are approaching this right now, which is why we've introduced legislation to change it, is that the way that things are structured right now is that a lot of these companies are passing the buck onto everyday working people. And so we have to invest in the infrastructure that will lower costs and pass those costs directly to everyday working people. Because, you know, if you look at, for example, if you want to, I think a really good example of this is what we saw in Texas earlier this year. There was this terrible freeze that occurred, and it completely just wrecked the energy system and grid in Texas. Now, first of all, why did that happen? It happened because a lot of companies were too cheap, I'll be frank, to try to retrofit their systems. They didn't want to spend the money, and they didn't want the government to ask them to spend the money on protecting their systems from a freeze. And both climate denying politicians and also companies that didn't want to be pressured into resiliency, into investing into resiliency, didn't do it. So the system shuts down. And so, first of all, because companies didn't want, they were trying to maximize their profit margin. And the more you have them invest in resilient infrastructure, the more it kind of impacts those short-term profits, frankly. And so it was this very market-driven crisis. But then when the system shuts down, tons of people across the state, if not millions of people across the state, went without power. If you were lucky enough to even have power, people who had power or turned their power on in the coming days then were hit with electricity bills that were, get this, $16,000, and $16,000 electricity bills after what was already a humanitarian crisis. And that is what happens when you allow corporations to just completely, frankly, lobby public officials and author our energy policy. And so there has to be a better way. And so first and foremost, if we had invested in these systems to begin with, I do not believe that the grid would have gone down the way that it did, and you would have saved all those people those $16,000 electricity bills. But even when it comes to our everyday life here in New York, with these slowly increasing prices are due to lack of infrastructure investment as well, I would argue. And the issue with gas and electric is that kind of electric and renewable resource energy is only going to get cheaper and cheaper. We're already starting to see this in a lot of different parts of the country. It's already naturally getting a lot more affordable than gas prices. But the key is that we have to make sure that those savings actually get passed on to you. And that's where really strong public policy that fights for working families can make a difference, because it's really easy for a company to say, well, if someone is already used to paying $60 a month or $100 a month or $200, whatever your living situation may be, and that is because that was the gas cost and that may be rising, then what difference would it make for us to charge the same or just a little bit less for electric, when in fact the actual cost of electric is much lower? And so that's what a lot of this climate focused policy that's coming out of, my office and our office is really focused on, is making sure that the actual infrastructure is fair so that those savings get passed on to the public and that they aren't being used to pad Wall Street profits, because that savings and that investment should not go to ExxonMobil, it should go to you.
All right, Congresswoman, thank you so much for being with us today. This concludes our town hall. We will now, first, thank you to all our constituents for joining us today. You can get a hold of us by giving us a call at 718-662-5970. You can also submit your questions on our website. The link is below. We will now move on to the press gaggle. So if you're a reporter and you would like to ask a question, please click the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and state your name and outlet in the question field. Reporters who are selected will be unmuted so they can ask their question to the member directly. So we'll give it a couple minutes or a couple seconds here as questions come in. All right, we have Kevin from NY1. Kevin, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Hi, Congresswoman. Thanks for doing this. I'm curious, with the 100-day mark of the Biden presidency coming up next week, how you'd evaluate how those first 100 days went in terms of his tone, but also mainly from a policy perspective, and what that tells you about what the next 100 days and beyond could look like. And as one of the faces of progressivism on Capitol Hill, I mean, do you think the Democrats will stick together as a coalition going forward? I mean, where do you think things are going?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I will say is that I do think that the Biden administration and President Biden has definitely exceeded expectations that progressives had. I'll be frank, I think a lot of us expected a much more conservative administration. And I think that not only what has ultimately come out, but the active invitation and willingness and collaboration with progressives in his first 100 days or almost 100 days has been very impressive. And so while there are there are areas where there are just plain areas of disagreement, I think that the actual conduct of the administration has absolutely been in good faith, but not just in good faith, but active incorporation of progressive legislation. And also for those of us individually, I can at least say that there has been a lot of openness and willingness and flexibility in incorporating many of our goals, requests, demands, et cetera. And I think that it has been to the benefit of the country. There were, in those early days with the American Rescue Plan, there was a lot of push and pull and tugging from within the Democratic Party. And there were areas where we put our foot down. There was a moment where those stimulus checks almost did not happen, or they would have happened in a smaller amount, or they would have happened for way less people. And I think that actual good faith interaction helped facilitate an environment where we could help a lot more people. And so I think that it's been good so far. I still think that it's quite early, because when it comes to some of these big things that have been passed, it's pretty much been the COVID bill. And so we're in the process of shaping the infrastructure bill. But I think that the infrastructure bill will be a key indicator on if the administration is keeping or raising its ambitions, or if that ARP was a one and done situation and that we're going smaller. I do think that the infrastructure plan is too small, but I think that his vision was right. I think that what he advanced as some of these key goals were the right ones and they were admirable ones. But I have real concerns that the actual dollars and cents and programmatic allocations in the bill don't meet the ambition of that vision of what's being sold. And so our job and what we're trying to do is really help the Biden administration in expanding that. And if we're able to do that, I think that's strong. And I think that that's a really strong indicator. In terms of cohesion of the Democratic Party, I think surprisingly, at least to me, I sense there has been a lot of collaboration in the House, given our razor thin margin, but I do think that the majority of the tension within the Democratic Party lies in the Senate. The decision by 8 senators to vote, against allowing, to vote against Senator Sanders' procedure that would essentially override the parliamentarian and include a $15 minimum wage in the ARP was extremely disappointing. And I think that there was this misperception that it would just be maybe 2 senators, but the fact that it was 8, I think was quite shocking to a lot of people. And I think it's a dynamic, especially when we are kind of done with our second reconciliation bill, could potentially just add a little bit more to that tension. And so how we resolve that is going to also be a key test.
Javier from Queens Latino. Javier? Javier, can you hear us?
Javier, you're on mute. Oh, okay, you're good.
So the Green New Deal is a 10-year plan to bring justice and stability to the USA. And the historic injustice and instability in Central America created by USA is forcing people to cross the border. So my question is how the Green New Deal can include a better future for the people of Central America, because the future of this continent is interconnected.
Mm-hmm. That is an incredible question. I couldn't have said it better myself. I think that there's some aspects both domestically and globally that we work on in our approach. One, domestically, the Green New Deal calls for a new classification of refugee visas, which will allow people that are disparately impacted by climate crises to petition to come to the United States under climate refugee status. So in terms of domestic policy, our position on the climate migration front for the United States is to create a new class, a new visa class for climate refugee status. And the reason for that is really important. And that's because historically, the United States has by far contributed the largest amount to our current carbon emissions. And so we bear disproportionate responsibility up to this point in total emissions. And the impact of those emissions are not impacting us domestically. They are impacting our brothers and sisters in Latin America and South Asia and other areas around the world. So that's the domestic piece. But I also think that globally, this question kind of comes up in other forms as well. When people say, well, what about China and what about India? We have the ability to include carbon goals in our trade practices. And we don't. And that was one of the reasons why I actually voted against the trade agreement last year, because there wasn't a single real climate piece that would help us decarbonize and bring international partners and other nations in the effort to decarbonize our country and our world. And then lastly, there is, I believe, a very clear correlation with just democracy and democratic practices. And I think it's really important that we incorporate in our foreign policy to not reward and to really acknowledge the damage that some authoritarian or other regimes have in disproportionately impacting and contributing to climate change. I think Brazil is a great example. And we have to start incorporating climate into and climate considerations into our diplomacy. And so there's that, as well as I believe a very deep need for the United States to acknowledge our unjust history and past of interventionist foreign policy that has also contributed to the destabilization of Latin America as well.
Great. And our last question, Nicole from CBS. Nicole, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, Congressman, for doing this. I was just curious if you're planning to attend the joint address next week, and whether you are or not, what are you hoping to hear from the president?
I would love to attend the joint address. Unfortunately, there are very strict COVID provisions that the House has put in place. And so I do not believe I will be able to enter the chamber for the joint address. I believe that according to current protocol, there's going to be an extreme limitation in the number of officials who are there. So I believe it will largely be the senior members of House leadership who will be there, and congressional leadership who may be there. So while I'd love to be there, I'm not sure if I will physically be able to due to COVID provisions. But I think overall, some of the things that are important for us is, I think in some respects, with how desperate the situation was with COVID, it was a bit easier for the entire party to come together, and the entire country really to come together on really big and bold solutions, whether it was direct stimulus check payments or whether it was our FEMA program. What I think I'll be listening for is what the scope of that ambition will be looking forward. Now that that bill's behind us, will that ambition really be matched, not just in goals, but in actual investments and policy? Because it's one thing to say what we want to do. It's another thing entirely to say, to be able to outline what specific steps we are looking to do to back up that actual goal. And so I'm really looking forward to that. I'm hoping we can cancel student debt. I'm hoping we can push on that. I'm hoping that we can finally get a path to citizenship for our 11 million people here in the United States. And I'm really hoping that, and I'm really going to be listening to a lot on union job creation, specifically when it comes to climate.
Great. Well, that concludes our town hall and the press gaggle for tonight. Thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you next time.
Okay. Thank you all so much.